I am very excited because I get to host our co-founder of TIG and someone who's been just a really good friend for a long time and excited for this conversation today. Dr. Kim Voll. Kim, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm very good. Excited to be here. Thanks, Matt.
Yay. And so I'm going to go out on a limb and I say I think most of these folks here know you. For anyone who doesn't know you, what do we need to know?
Oh gosh, well, yes, lovely to see so many familiar faces. As I mentioned earlier, for those just joining, I can't literally see you from this perspective, but I keep seeing your names pop up, so it's wonderful that to see all those names. Yeah, for those who haven't met me before or aren't familiar with my work, my name's Kim, as Matt already mentioned. My background is a little bit varied. I have a PhD in computer science specializing in AI from 30,000 years ago. As well as an undergrad in cognitive science, which really specializes, or at least I specialized a lot in like human motivations and why we do the things that we do. My primary research for the last 10 to 15 years, I would say, and longer really, has been what I now call player dynamics, which you can think of as the social dynamics, the player interactions. Like essentially, if you put one or more humans in a digital space, particularly games, that's the kind of stuff that I focus on. So why do people do what they do, root causes, that sort of thing. And with that, I focus a lot on design methodology, interventions, policy work, all sorts of things. In addition to being a researcher, I'm also a game designer, I'm also a programmer, an educator. I have shipped a lot of games over the years on all sorts of platforms, including VR. I worked at Riot for many years, which is how I met some of you in that context as the head of player dynamics. And today I'm very lucky to be the CEO of Brace Yourself Games, which is a mid-sized indie company up here in Vancouver, Canada.
Now, very exciting stuff. No, excited. We just got our first international. Uh, Jared, thanks for joining. Or
Wait, I
Adam,
don't
thank you.
count?
Well, I mean,
Just
this
kidding, just kidding, just
I'm thinking
kidding.
hemisphere. I went a little too narrow.
Yeah, if you can get in the
Uh,
car and drive in a relatively short amount of time to get to me, probably doesn't count. That's
yeah,
fair.
we'll hop on the old outlaw highway, Canada and Mexico. We got this. Um, no, and player behavior because it was going back. I remember we met in like the first Fair Play Summit back in like 2018. Like you were one of the first people that I ever spoke to who actually spoke in terms of like, oh, we can prevent harms. And I remember my brain was like, wait, we can prevent this? And it was just, it was exciting to hear that from an industry perspective, particularly from gaming, which I didn't know a lot about back then, 7 years ago back then. And it's just fascinating, as we start to, my own experience looking at just human development and human interaction and how that starts to translate in online worlds and spaces and how we can start to think about, design techniques and things like that. It's been so fascinating to kind of just not only learn from you, but to be now here with TIG and hopefully continuing to foster and just advocate for this work is pretty incredible. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has been super exciting to see, what was way back when the Fair Play Alliance evolving into today, the Thriving in Games group. And I mean, even in the name change, it speaks volumes of the journey that we've been on in understanding more about the space and our own opportunities and largely responsibilities, I think, as game developers in how we take care of the spaces that we create and the people within those spaces. So it's super exciting to have you as well. I mean, an executive director of TIG on payroll. Like what a milestone to have reached as an organization from, what was it, 10 years ago or so when we
yeah.
first scrabbled together a small group of like-minded folks who, just essentially were all kind of stressed about a lot of the same topics and questions and feeling, I mean, I certainly won't speak for others, but certainly I was feeling, awash in a sea of a lot of different motivations and constraints and realities of the game development industry that weren't always so conducive to the work that we do, and just trying to figure out, carve a path through that, and to have done that with so many amazing people along the way. It's very exciting to look back on that, and even in difficult times to look ahead at what I think is ultimately still a great future.
No, and I agree. TIG's done a good job of that, and of just bringing in a diverse group of voices to kind of share their expertise and provide insight, particularly through the playbook. I think it's just a great avenue to kind of sort of let folks shine. Is at the end of the day, like we're just trying to make this better for players, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think for for many of us, the reason we make games is for players, because we love players. We love creating spaces that spark joy in other people. We love creating spaces that others can have great experiences with other people within. For many of us, we love the games ourselves. So like being able to create these spaces that maybe we grew up fantasizing about, and we're now generating these spaces we can spend time in with folks that with like-minded folks who share similar interests in the kinds of play spaces and so forth. So yeah, it's such a privilege to be able to have a career in games, and to be able to, nowadays when we look at the scale of gaming, to be building spaces that really are part of our social infrastructure, which is such a privilege and a powerful opportunity for all of us.
No, I wholeheartedly agree, particularly when those shared spaces have shared experiences. It's such a human way to kind of connect through just something that we have in common, right? And that's something that's been, whether you shop at the same store or you go see the movie at the same time, though I think that one's diminishing. Like video games seem to be kind of almost like that third common space that society has built up. Then it's like, hey, you pretend, have some fun, play a game. And here we are. I get to kind of experience this with some other people, and how much thought goes into making sure that experience is as just as fun and positive as possible.
Yeah, and video games are where people are at today. And I think that is one of the most critical things we have to keep in mind. I think less and less over every year do we see the same level of stigma, putting games as this weird esoteric thing that only nerds do or what have you. I think video games are very much a mainstream pursuit now, and are very much, as we see through the numbers in games, where people are at. And that comes with a whole host of challenges. And in some ways, those challenges have grown over time, in part because there's so many more people. And wherever the people are all the problems that come with people. And video
Yeah.
games are not unique in that. What video games are really doing is just creating a space that doesn't have the same social affordances and constraints and whatnot that we have painstakingly evolved over many, many, many years in person, from earliest pre-technology days through to now. We've seen just this rapid acceleration of interfacing through digital experiences, through digitally mediated experiences. And that makes things hard. And that's I think to me, that's very much at the crux of the work that we do as TIG, is we look at these spaces, we see and celebrate the power of video games and how important it is to have these spaces and how special they are, while also creating space to understand and ask critical questions about how the nature of these spaces and the ways in which they're designed, the nature of us as human beings in these spaces, in what ways do those threaten or undermine the sanctity of these spaces.
No, well, and that's the case. Let's get into it. Just a quick reminder, folks,
Yeah.
if you have questions, drop it in the chat. But let's go timely. So one of the titles that's been in the news a lot lately is Arc Raiders, because they had a new drop, and particularly we know that mapping, measuring, detecting behavior in games is tough, but especially PvE, PvP. Arc Raiders made the news because their matchmaking system, and it's very. I had to read a few articles because the information was a little janky. But ultimately, players are indicating that they're in rooms, and some of those rooms are more aggressive than others. And some are saying, "Hey, they love it." Others are like, "Wait a minute, who am I getting grouped with? Why is that?" Like one headline was even like, "If you're in a room that feels more aggressive, it's your fault." And I'm just like, "Because that's nice to say." So trying to understand, as we think about matchmaking, and
Mhm.
behavior. What are some of the challenges that titles face when developing games that feature have that feature in there? What steps can we take to try and set players up to be successful in the game and play their goals, especially as we think about healthy communities? Pairing the wrong folks together could lead to some very negative outcomes, and vice versa. So I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on that and how we can think about it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, great question. Super topical. I think that it is a very rich substrate to work with when it comes to thinking about multiplayer games. Like very often we talk about the mechanics or the social systems or whatnot. And I think oftentimes the underlying matchmaking that puts these people together in the first place is sometimes underconsidered as part of that rich substrate. And, I'm sure everyone here is probably at least somewhat familiar with matchmaking. You can largely think of it as pretty much warm bodies. If you've got a warm body you're in, like just grouping people together, sometimes based on light constraints, sometimes not, as if you've ever been in an experience where it's pretty rough. There might not be things that are looking to optimize your play experience and so forth, all the way to far more sophisticated matchmaking systems. So if you are familiar with matchmaking, there's kind of the trifecta that we try to balance. So we want it to be fair, fast, and low latency. So fair, you can think of as a measure of quality. I think that is a definition that is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and there's a lot there we can dig into, which I will in a moment. We want, of course, fast matching times. So I don't want to sit and wait in queue for 20 minutes, ideally, right? Sometimes I don't want to wait 20 seconds. And there's a lot of different tolerances that exist there within players as well. And then of course, low latency, your ping and whatnot matters a lot for the quality of the play experience, also the competitive integrity where that matters and so forth. So it's fundamentally already a very challenging space. Typically you can tune, usually two of those three things well at the expense of the other. So if you want to have really fair matches, and allow people to join really quickly, so fast matchmaking, you're probably going to compromise on latency because you're having to pull from a pool that's wider and so forth. So it's a really tough space. And one of the things that makes it tough, I've worked on some very big games, very, very big games. And even at that scale, it's shocking how quickly, when you do the math, adding too many constraints takes an enormous pool down to basically nothing, and your latency just skyrockets, or your matching time skyrockets. Like if you think about region shard, if you think about input segregation, like what are you playing on? Are you doing cross-platform or not? Are you trying to get a tight skill band or not? Are you bringing other things like aggressive play styles into the match? And all of those things are essentially thinning the herd. So you could have, if you've got a 10-player lobby, a 5v5 game, for instance, you could be looking at a 5, 6, 10-minute wait if you tune enough of those knobs. So that's sort of just to set the stage of how challenging this space is. It can seem like, well, it's obvious we should just do this and calculate this. But you really are compromising on a lot of things that degrade significantly the play experience and can lead to a high level of churn. So that's, I think, all important to keep in mind. So now let's take a look at ARC and more generally, I think that opportunity space. So I think there's some really powerful stuff here. I think there's some very interesting things. I have long said, although full disclosure, I have not shipped a system with these exact qualities, but I have long said and researched into play styles and other variables as input into matchmaking systems. Because what we can do is we can have what we call soft constraints. So soft constraints are essentially things that they're still constraints, but given the conditions, you might gracefully degrade how hard those constraints are held. So if I say, here's this very silly example. I only want to play with Matt. So the matchmaking algorithm is like, well, Matt's not online, so you just wait indefinitely until Matt shows up online. Like, well, what if you compromise with this other person? There's no Matt, but like you could play with this other person. And I'm like, okay, fine, I'll play with them. So there's ways in which we can say the thing that you want or that you think players want, you prioritize that until such time as it surpasses a certain restriction in the quality of that play experience. And that's where some of this, I don't work on ARC. I haven't worked with those folks. I'm sure they're lovely, but I don't know anything specific about this, so I am speaking as an outsider more generally. But I think that's where some of this play style matching can come in as an interesting soft constraint layered onto some of these systems. It may be more of a hard constraint or not. I mean, obviously, there's proprietary specifics in there. But there's some interesting things around play style matching. One is, I think it opens up the space for us to consider differently what makes a good match. So maybe the reason I always want to play with Matt is because he doesn't take himself too seriously and he likes to joke around and I like to joke around. I'm a total ham bone, and I take the game seriously, as in I'm not throwing the match or something. I prefer lighthearted, a bit of joking around and whatnot. And if there was a way to match on those sort of personality traits, if you will, that would probably lead to a better experience. And for those of us who don't necessarily have a gaming group at the ready that they've pre-curated, if you're not playing with a pre-made group, you might be interested in a system that could help you matchmake with people that have a little bit more like interests or play a little bit more similarly to you. So I think there's a very rich and interesting space there. The challenge, though, that comes in, and I'm not saying this is true of ARC, just more something we need to consider more broadly, is we also don't want to end up in a world that some of you may have encountered that's often referred to as the prisoner's island, where you take all of the, I'm going to do some heavy lifting with some air quotes here, all of the bad players, and you put them all off over here, and you say, well, you're naughty, you like to say, questionable things, and you lose your temper, and shoot first, ask questions later, right? You don't have the no shoot mantra baked in ARC Raiders. So you all go play over here together, and the rest of us, quote unquote, again, will play over here. And won't that be a lovely experience? And maybe on some surface, it might be a little bit better for these folks over here. But what you've done is you've created a space that is now a holding pen for all of the most problematic human traits. And those just tend to concentrate and bubble over. And despite your best efforts, they tend to bleed right back out. But what you're really doing is hardening these behaviors, you're hardening these patterns, you're normalizing things in a way that then shows up in other games, may show up in other game modes. I have talked about having to relax constraints under certain conditions, right? Like we can't be assured that that fence stays up, and it's just not a productive way to do things. The other thing it misses is fundamentally the fact that the people over here, they're somehow perfect. Things are going to go wrong over here, and we're treating it as if we have rectified this issue. So it doesn't work. Lots of folks have experimented with it to varying degrees of success, but largely these things don't work, and they are not recommended best practice. So those are the things to consider. There's a rich substrate of opportunity here to understand what makes a good match and ways in which we can help those players find each other, whether through more formal matchmaking or game modes or other tools. And then there are these risks of what can happen when we lean too far into divisions that we're treating as if they are hard divisions, when in fact they're the natural ebb and flow of what it means to be human and be human in digital spaces.
Yeah, it's totally an easy job. No, it's funny. Like you sparked a couple of memories. Like one, I know Natasha Miller spoke about this at a conference we attended last year with Overwatch, and about how the level of feature control, people like, hey, I'm looking for a match, but here's the things I'm looking for, right? Like, I only want matches with chat or voice, or they even talk about a trust score. So individuals knew if they were joining someone on a quest, they could look at their trust score and be like, oh, this person, is reliable. If they say they're going after the dragon to get some jewel or something, that's exactly what they're going to do. And so like there's all of these sort of levers, and the latency question is fascinating because like obviously the more you layer up, the tougher that becomes. But thinking through, how much do we do as a platform internally to kind of control that? How much do we do? We put the hands of the player to kind of determine a little bit of their outcome and that autonomy. And I think that's where some of the pushback came on Arc Raiders, was that players didn't know why they were ending up in these groups. And
Yeah. So I think that's a very important call out for a variety of reasons. I mean, those of us who worked in this area and have had to deal with the sometimes frightening prospect of communicating to players about some of these systems. It can be a very intimidating prospect to reveal more about your system. Sometimes there's secret sauce there too, so you might be under constraints to not talk about proprietary aspects of your algorithm. But I can totally appreciate why players want to know why they're ending up where they're at. I mean, this is part of the experience, and if that experience is subpar, or even if it's not, I think there is a reasonable level of disclosure that is nice to provide for players so they can understand why they're ending up in these spaces. But it is a double-edged sword. There are systems that we work with that sometimes are not fully disclosed, and that's intentionally because they expose aspects of the system that can be gamed and abused, thereby undermining them. We also deal with situations where players, as much thought and effort as we can put into these systems or into various game modes humans are fundamentally unpredictable. And so throwing them into this mix, we could fully disclose aspects of this. We could say instead, well, let's just make a game mode that's casual mode or whatever. And we've all been in there, right? Companies have done that, which is great. And it's nice to know that those exist. But what happens is you typically have, the cat at the aquarium, right? Like it's just someone who has goals and objectives that are contrary to maybe the intent of the space, see it as easy pickings to have some fun with whatever their goals are. So sometimes the reason we want to do this algorithmically isn't even just a question of scale, it's to put up some degree of buffer between gaming the system and not. And so that brings us back to too much transparency then can sometimes undermine that effort. So it's very difficult to balance, and not everyone has the same level of comfort with disclosure or expectations of disclosure from various game companies.
No, I think you're hitting on something huge, right? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about human behavior. And particularly, how do we understand behavior when it comes to community health, which can impact player matching, gameplay, goals, cheating, exploitation. There's like a lot of challenges in there. So, what are some of the root causes we could look at? Let's say we're coming into this new, and this could be, data points, things that we need to consider, particularly around community health and how players get along in these spaces.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge area, right? I mean, this is kind of, great question. But I think just for everyone's context, in a nutshell, this is what TIP does, right? Like this is the entire bucket of research, and by many measures is just, like what can we do about this? What can we look at? What are the knobs we have as game developers that allow us to refine and improve these spaces or make them more conducive to healthier outcomes in the first place? So it's such a good question. I know I have a tendency to talk way too much, so I'll try to keep it contained myself as well. So I think that there's a ton of value in the why. Oftentimes why, I think, can be confused with like a dismissal or a why not, or an undermining of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. But asking why isn't the same as justifying or saying a behavior is okay. I think understanding why is what allows us to go upstream and hopefully prevent these sorts of things in the future. So I think why is one of our most important questions. And when we look at it in the context of multiplayer games, I think there's a lot there that comes up when we look at why. There's everything from how the game is designed, and that's not to go around waggling fingers at everyone. I will design gooder and the game will be a better experience. I'm a game designer, it's freaking hard stuff, I get it. But it doesn't mean there's not things we can keep in mind. There's not better questions we can ask when we're considering the designs. So things that immediately come to mind are, through our designs, have we inadvertently introduced competition where there shouldn't be competition? So if we're talking about not to make this all about shooting games, but if we're talking about a standard FPS game, first-person shooter game, where the primary metric is kills, deaths, assists, KDAs, right? I mean, then yes, the primary expression of skill within that game is kills and to a lesser extent assists. But maybe we've also introduced another form of competition that exists in the lobby, that exists in getting the role you want, that exists in getting the weapon you want. And then it's for us to ask, well, is that a fundamentally important part of the experience that we're trying to create? Or is that potentially undermining it? Is that getting games off on the wrong foot? Is that creating tension between players who should be acting as a team, and so forth? So there's all that opportunity space to look at where maybe our designs are undermining, introducing conflict, introducing confusion. Confusion can generate a ton of conflict between players. And then there's also where could we be encouraging healthier behaviors? So where can we make it more fun to behave as a team, to be good to each other, to be pro-social? How can we incentivize those behaviors? And there's also we can go a little bit more fine-tuned as well, because we can say there can be ways in which it's fun to support each other because the game celebrates you, or maybe others celebrate you. There's a lot of social credit that can be built up in these situations. But oftentimes it can work just as well to incentivize certain behaviors that present to other players as pro-social or beneficial. So Matt might be doing, I don't know, I have no game in mind right now. Matt brings me a turnip, and I'm like, what guy brought me a turnip? Like, I need a turnip right now. That's awesome. And now I'm very happy because Matt brought me a turnip. And I think Matt's a good guy. Meanwhile, Matt had a little thing that popped up and said, give in the next player you see a turnip. Matt didn't necessarily set out to do a good thing for me, but I felt good. And now I'm going to behave more charitably toward Matt. So this can seem inconsequential, but when you do this at scale, what happens is the dominant norm shifts in favor of these more charitable interpretations, and you can shift the environment of the game. It doesn't, we should not be naive. It doesn't eradicate bad behavior. It doesn't eradicate disruptive players that are intent on disrupting the experience, of course, but it does make a community on the whole and a play space on the whole more resilient to these behaviors in the first place. And I think that is a very critical thing that we need to consider is when people don't feel safe, when they don't feel like they belong, they can either act out or they may not defend themselves or others in a way that then could have otherwise increased the community resilience or inoculated it against some of these behaviors. And so we see then, problematic behavior begets further problematic behavior. You see a degradation or a breakdown in these communities.
No, it even sounds like creating opportunities to more naturally demonstrate those behaviors, right? So not like kind of
Yeah.
like a forced niceness per se, but it's just, like I know Wes talked about this, like if you have an incident where you're in a battle with another player and you can't heal yourself, but you can heal your teammate, right? So you're sort of subconsciously imbuing on players that, oh no, this is what you do in this game. You can heal your teammates and you can support players and do things like that.
Yeah, I mean, you set that up as the expectation, you build and design the game around supporting those outcomes, and you also do the critical analyses of, when does this get cheesy? When does this get annoying? There's a certain level of tolerance within a community and within an individual. Those are not always the same thing. In fact, they're rarely the same thing. But understanding that can help you tune it in a way so that your community is more receptive to it. It feels more natural.
Hmm.
It feels more natural in the context of the game itself and supports sort of what the game is about. So I think there's a lot of things that when we look at what causes other people to view those around them more charitably, there's a lot of really rich design space there. And similarly, what causes people to get more annoyed by other people, there's a lot of really good design space there. And we often talk about CGI. So community being one perspective of how we can think about these dynamics and our interventions, as well as the group, which is the smaller scale, 2 or more people in a space, usually a shared play context in that moment, to the individual, like if I wake up on the wrong side of the bed, I skip lunch, I don't know, whatever, right? Maybe I'll get cranky. And now I'm coming into a play experience cranky. You probably can't do anything about that, right? Maybe you could
No.
airdrop me a snack or something, but like realistically, we're probably not doing anything about that. But just the knowledge of knowing that you will face circumstances that you can't control means you can make the system on the whole a little bit more resilient given those spikes of behavior as well.
Oh, you totally just gave me an idea for a Snickers commercial where it's just like player 157 is cranky. Just like a drone taking off at the Snickers bar.
Yeah, it's a whole new concept of loot box. Just taking it in a whole new direction. Physical loot boxes.
Oh, that'd
What
be
possible
hilarious.
controversy could exist there?
None whatsoever. No privacy
None.
issues.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
No, you're kind of reminding me because I know, my first experience trying to do healthy behaviors was on a game called MVU, IMVU, and a virtual world had been around since 2006. And I mean, we're getting good at detecting negative behaviors, but like the healthy side, we started mapping out what are the things players are doing sort of naturally within the environment. And we looked
Mhm.
at greeters, we looked at educators. People are like, here's how you play the game. And we had others who are tending to be more encouraging. And so if someone was not having the best experience, maybe they're logging in less, we can pair them with these folks who are more encouraging, who can kind of show them the ropes and how to experience things. It was interesting to me to see how there's this intentional effort because ultimately you're driving culture in the game and how
Mhm.
players interact and sort of giving them not force, but what feels sort of a natural way to participate and feel like you're connected to something bigger than just showing up and having an experience.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've often described video games as engines of culture for many reasons, not least of which is the human interactions within multiplayer games. Although I think it's broader than that, and I think there's a ton of opportunity, and as I like to say, there's opportunity and responsibility as the caretakers of these spaces to be thoughtful around these things. But it is a very difficult problem space. I think there's a thin line between leaning too far into hyper constraining these spaces and getting a little too Black Mirror
Yeah.
versus total chaos. I can't sit here and be like, the line is here. I think we're uncovering that all the time. But I do think that there is a lot to be said for understanding like baseline safety as a fundamental aspect, but also just the broader question of what is, Wes and I were talking about this yesterday, what is good multiplayer design? Like, what is that? What is that experience? We don't need to, so often the conversation gets mired in, oh, well, we can't say this word anymore, and we can't do this, and this is a fundamental truncation of our freedoms, and et cetera, et
Mhm.
cetera. And I see why people get there. I see why people are afraid. I often use the example of, if you consider someone at the top of the privilege pyramid, let's say cis, white, hetero, male, rolling in dough, whatever, right? Pile on the privilege. And this person's a gamer and they have played games for a long time, and maybe they have some other aspects of their life that have made it difficult for them to socialize outside of the gaming context, or for whatever reason they prefer socializing in the gaming context. This for them in a very human way has become a safe space for them. And this is not to pit one set of privileges against the next or anything, but just to say, to go back to that fundamental question of why, a lot of the times the things that we're talking about, the changes that we're talking about, can be interpreted by an individual in that context as taking away their rights, as taking away their safe space, as where previously they knew how to joke around with their friends and fit in and people laughed at them and they were part of a community, now that's being threatened. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. And those of you who know me, I am very outspoken on DEI and underrepresented groups and supporting marginalized groups and so forth. So like, I'm all in on that. But this question of why helps us start to understand, when we're thinking about interventions and changes that we're bringing in, where some of this reaction might come from, how players might be reacting strongly, and perhaps where there's opportunities for us to maybe modify that intervention in a way that still upholds our safety goals fundamentally, first and foremost, but maybe helps players lessen a little bit of that fear or smooths the introduction of some of these changes in, so it feels less of an attack. All other things being equal, I think the world has shown us time and time again that the effort needs to go into lifting up the underrepresented groups. But I think we can still maintain compassion and understanding for the broader perspective and have that factor into our designs as well.
No, and we're gonna pull that thread a little bit more. I want to jump really quick to a question in the chat from Cooper. It said there's a lot of discussion online around some games, and he mentions Marvel Rivals, Apex Legends, OW2, using engagement-based metrics, i.e., trying to get the player to stay online as long as possible with competitive ranked MM models. What are your thoughts on this? That's a
uh,
big one.
that's a big
Yeah, I
one.
mean,
Thank you for the question.
yeah. I mean, the same, but what about using engagement models to kind of just keep people
Yeah.
playing?
I mean, I want to, first of all, I'm going to caveat this with the hopefully obvious observation, but like a lot of these decisions have a lot more complexity under the hood than we're
Yep.
ever aware of, and they get, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know the full context. So I'm not going to comment on any specific game. But let me talk about the risks of engagement-based design. Because I think it's very risky. If that is your primary metric, we've slowly migrated into an industry that I think in a lot of ways defines success as just more, 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 more. You got to play longer. You got to stay engaged longer,
No.
in a very unrealistic and unhealthy way. Like way back when, if we were talking about, oh yeah, I mean, if people are joining a game and then immediately quitting and moving on to the next thing, yeah, that's a bad engagement model. You're not going to do very well. You're not going to be around very long as a company if that's your engagement pattern. But also 24/7, never leaving. Like that's also, that's not, it's not like a one-way street where that's the ultimate thing we're all
Yeah.
trying to achieve, right? So how do we define healthy patterns of engagement that are not in contradiction to how we look out for players and individual health, while we're still allowing space for us to recognize that fundamentally this is a business, and it's frankly a very hard business, especially for many of us who are at smaller companies. And I think that's kind of the crux of it. So when we're doing things like, excuse me, potentially matching people on the basis of engagement patterns and so forth, there's a version of that that I think could be healthy, right? If we're defining engagement in terms of when you engage, like you're a lunchtime warrior, Matt. You play every time at whatever every day. Pardon me. At this time, grouping other lunchtime warriors together might make sense, right? Like that's an engagement pattern that I don't think is necessarily unhealthy. If you're a player that instead plays 12 plus hours a day, and we just group you with all of those players, well, then we're leading to, there's potentially some responsibility that comes from the fact that these are now players that are likely going to incentivize this behavior within each other. And I'm not saying it's our responsibility necessarily, or that it makes sense for us to try to go around and stop all unhealthy play patterns, but we can
Hmm.
certainly do our best to take a reasonable level of responsibility to not facilitate those patterns, to share. I mean, maybe we don't all go do the Nintendo Wii gently blowing curtains in the breeze pop up take a break kind of mode, but I think there are things that we can do that lead to healthier patterns in players. Same thing like when it comes to like predatory monetization. We
Hmm.
don't need to go down that road. That's terrible. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Instead, we can have things like caps on max spending and other things that allow us to say like, hey, there is value in a microtransaction world, but some measures to allow players a little bit more concrete control over the type of experience that they're having through what they purchase, how they play, etc. And at the same time, we can like lop off extremes and have things that hopefully none of our interventions will able to work for every player. But if they work for enough players, that can be a meaningful full difference. So I guess my quick response is that like caution, 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 caution. I think we have to be extremely careful and extremely robust in thinking through the implications of these things, because I think they can have long-term detrimental consequences on the health and wellness of a community and individuals within it.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think I would add to that too, and particularly if you're aware of design or, those sort of levers and recognize when they're getting pulled. Like for me, when I play a game, I'm just like, I see what you're trying to do. And so it's kind of a moment for me where I'm like, all right, I got to step back. Like they're trying to pull me in here. And you just kind of, like, as you start to recognize, right? It's the curse of knowing too much. And be like, oh, I see
Yeah.
what they did with this.
And I think that there's a space for like third-party organizations to help increase player savviness in these
Hmm.
environments. But like ultimately, I think it's our job as an industry to do better. And
Yeah.
some companies are going to be, we'll share a mindset that it's like, please the stakeholders at all costs, up and to the right. That's the only thing that matters. And maybe there's not much we can do to dissuade that. But I don't think that's most of us. I don't think that's
Yeah.
most companies. I think genuinely most gaming companies are absolutely trying to do right by players. And sometimes when we end
Hmm.
up in these situations where maybe our decisions are not as favorable towards players, it's either because we didn't know as much, in which case, I mean, that's why TIG exists, to help educate, and it's why
Hmm.
we're all here to support each other. And sometimes it can be because there's external pressures that are making it extremely difficult. Like all of this work gets extremely hard when when it's in the context of an existential threat against a company, right? Like some companies will fall in different places around the question of, do we do this or not? Well, if we do it, it's better for players, but if we don't do it, it's better for us and we might survive as a company. And that is
Yep.
a genuinely hard decision, especially in today's job climate. So I think we are talking about very complex decision spaces on the business side as well that can lead us down, unfortunately, some unhealthy paths if we're not very, very careful.
No, agree. So I'm going to work back. You were touching on this a second ago. Excuse me. Now it's my turn. But as like you're a huge proponent of inclusion in games and DI, all that other stuff. As we think about demographics in games, they can be problematic, especially thinking about, particularly about gender. Gender in gaming has been a challenge for a long time. But gender and representation. So when we think about, trying to get your thoughts, unfair representation, how that sometimes get baked into games, either intentionally or unintentionally, and we end up seeing sort of these problematic biases that sort of seep in to the culture and design. So how can we start to think about sort of reforming demographics? Then like games are for everybody. I'd take is about inclusiveness. Like, how do we start to think about that and approach that in a way that's meaningful?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Games are for everyone. There's no reason they shouldn't be. I think that fundamentally games are about creating inclusive spaces where we can belong. They have long been spaces that many of us who have felt marginalized for a variety of reasons have come to feel a strong sense of belonging. And at the same time, they have been spaces that have been weaponized against belonging, and have exacerbated marginalization and whatnot. And some of that has been a consequence of the political and cultural climate. Some of that has been literal design choices that we have made within games without realizing it, and so forth. Like there's lots of stuff there. I think that when we look back historically at games, I mean, games started out as a product, as a thing you take off a shelf, you play with it, you put it back, and so forth. And they were, they came up in the context of a lot of traditional sales and marketing tactics, even as we've deviated and needed to find different approaches that work better for the digital. They still were born in that context, and as a result of that, in part anyway, we see a lot of demographics-based decision making. So this game is being marketed to this particular demographic, males aged whatever to whatever, housewives, whatever, like I'm pulling from like especially some of the older examples, right? I mean, wouldn't hopefully a lot of that wouldn't fly today, but some of it certainly still does. There's definitely, and one more caveat here, I'm not talking about the distinction between young people and adults. There's a lot of like very important reason to understand those boundaries and the various maturity levels of the audiences. But let's just say for this, we're talking more about adults, so firmly in adult territory. In that context, what if you turns out if you identify one gender and you market to that gender, guess who you sell more to? Right? We create these self-fulfilling prophecies when we use demographics as our fundamental measure. That's not to say there's not value in segmentation, though, right? I understand why we don't, one of the worst things you could do in game development is make a game for everyone. Some people manage to pull it off, or there are things that sort of grab the cultural zeitgeist at the time. But like largely speaking, good game development means knowing the game you are and making that game and understanding your audience. And if there's not an audience for that game, guess what? If you're a business, you probably shouldn't sell that game. But ultimately, I think there are better, smarter ways that don't bake in stereotypes into how we think about game development. Because no matter how hard we try, these demographics bleed into all of our decisions. They color and influence things in significant ways. So that's how you end up with things like, depending on what era you're looking at, like pink is for girls and blue is for boys, like arbitrary binaries and color fixations and things that make no sense when you actually look at the full tapestry of human experience and gender expression and so forth. But what we should be focusing on in games is what we're good at, is what games are about, what people like to play or don't like to play. Like, what are those attributes? So as a designer, I use a tool called player typologies, which is not like some rocket science here. It's kind of a little bit of what it says on the tin, which is essentially taking a look at the attributes of players, inclusive of their motivations, their play context. It's broader than, if you've done I've done a lot of UX work over my career. If you come from a UX background, you might have worked with personas, which are essentially a fictionalized instance of a type of player that exists to represent players who have those qualities. Sometimes they aggressively bake in demographic information. Other times they're more just sort of general personality aspects. And they can't cover a lot of these things, and you might go, ah, this is the same thing. And that's totally fair if you feel that way. I've liked to differentiate them because I think that it more tightly brings in motivation and behavior, but they also give us a path to multiple lenses. So the reason I use typologies is I will create multiple typologies, which are sets of categorical distinctions between players that are centered on different aspects of how you might come to a game. So for example, you might divide along social preferences. You have, and you can give them silly names or whatever names, it doesn't really matter, number them for all I care, but you might have the social butterfly category over here who's going to be eager to engage and whatever. You might have the really shy but socially curious person over here, or group of people, and so forth. And you can imagine all sorts of different ways that people might come to your game through that lens specifically. And this allows you then to design for those specific behaviors or patterns or whatever the category of distinction is. And sometimes it's a complex collection of things. And then you can hold up features, decisions, policies, etc., to each of these categories as a way of understanding players who fall more in this category. How are they going to come to this feature? How will they receive this announcement? So on and so forth. So to tie it back to demographics and underrepresentation, whether it's gender or any other aspect of traditionally underrepresented or marginalized identities, you can create ones based on marginalized communities. You can identify dominant communities, more marginalized communities, and you can create now a tool, a really easy reference tool, quite frankly, I use these all the time, where you can now say, okay, these are very difficult decision spaces with a lot of complexities. But if you can create a nice tool where you can say, all right, I want to introduce this change to my matchmaking, or I want to introduce this mechanic or whatever, now let's look through each one of these and see how it might affect these. And what this does is it holds space for traditionally underrepresented communities in a very meaningful and design-centric way. And this then can also be used in how you approach marketing, in how you query your player base, because it turns out if you query your player base, like survey or whatever, guess what's going to be underrepresented? The underrepresented people. So drawing conclusions based on that, where you have a whole potential audience over here, is not very good business sense as well.
Is that your way of saying statistical truth carries over? It's representative of the representation. Um, no, and you hit on I like the typology is huge because I think you hit on something, as I started to particularly understand player dynamics is like one, defining what those categories are, or looking at the data of the players and being able to define those categories as you think about not just experiences, but interactions, how you design for inclusion, and recognizing sort of these different things that are coming in. I often think my experience, particularly being on the safety side, is that people create a game that they think will be fun. And there's the unintentional bias, right? Without thinking about like, well, how will other people who don't think like I do also find this fun? So it is not intentional in any way, shape, or means. But that's where I think having something like the Take Playbook, or even just people on your team would be like, well, hey, can we look at these additional things as well? Kind of make sure that your game is now open to a wider audience. And that's where, like we say, when players thrive, like these titles will thrive as well, because now you have a space
Yeah.
where it's accessible by more people who are all coming in and saying, I love playing this game together with my friends or whoever.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. In inclusion and representation exists at multiple facets of the development space. Like it exists within our own walls as a studio, or virtual walls as a studio. It exists within the content, of course, that we produce, and it exists within the player communities that are generated around our products. And all of those provide really valuable ways to look at this. I think that a key thing to remember when you're thinking about representation is it's not everyone everywhere. I can't hire
Yeah,
one of everyone at my company. That doesn't even make
right.
sense. What does that mean, right? Especially you consider intersectionality and whatnot. It is an impossible quest. But what we can do as a small company is hold ourselves accountable to the greatest amount of diversity that we can, and a practice and multiple practices of seeking out additional perspectives, of growing our understanding, of challenging our biases regularly, of creating games that, I mean, we've made lots of mistakes, and we'll probably make more mistakes. We'll certainly make more mistakes, but we try to learn from them and grow and develop. So representation is a very, very difficult space. It can be very intimidating and very scary, but I think there are paths to it. And ultimately, I think if you want to just wear your business hat, I think it is a much more practical and financially successful approach, because you broaden the funnel to more people.
Yeah. No, I think, and the one danger to what you shared is I've also talked to folks, is almost like a weird reverse tokenism, right? To where it's just like, oh, Kim, you're a woman. Can you tell us your experience in gaming and how we can make our game better? And then you sit in
Yes.
a room full of, 50 white dudes, trying to explain your experience as a female gamer. Like, oh, I've never had that. Like, does that really happen? Right. So that, like, trying to strike that middle, I think
Yeah.
there's
You
much
have
to
to
be
be so
said.
careful. You have to be
Yep.
so, so careful. And we have to be thoughtful of, for, those of us with marginalized identities or multiple marginalized identities, we don't know what individual traumas or experiences we've had. And it's not for us to put that responsibility on the shoulders of those that have otherwise been oppressed or mistreated by society. Some may want to opt into that, which is great, and they're welcome, but we can't just decide, well, you've got that identity, therefore now your responsibility. It's also just crushing,
Yep.
the sense of responsibility that I have to represent my marginalized identities if they
Hmm.
are fully revealed, and not, like not appear as a bad gamer or somehow, and like undermine anyone who's not, non-male
No.
gamers and whatnot because I'm a bad gamer. Like there's a lot of complexity that sits around what that means when those are put on other people's.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot here we could dig into, but I think that allyship is fundamentally important, but it's also complex and
Yep.
nuanced.
Oh, allyship and empathy are huge. I think just those two factors together. Well, I have one more question for you. I'll throw it out to our attendees. If you do have a question, want to drop it in. We got about 5 minutes left here. As we're waiting for that, I mean, I do have two questions. We'll see how time goes. But the big one, I mean, I'm always excited. I love talking about sort of a what's next type question. As we look at the future of gaming, all of the industry reports and others seem very uh, positive in terms of the growth of games and adoption of games and people playing games. So as we look at the broader industry, 2026 and beyond, what are some predictions that you have about where the industry is going and sort of kind of what we can expect next?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, probably not to imply predicting the future is ever easy. What do I know anyway? But I think we're seeing a lot of interesting trends right now. I mean, we're certainly seeing significant changes to workflow with the
Hmm.
growing sophistication of AI, or not sophisticated, depending on who you ask or what you look at. But I think that's affecting our workflow. It's affecting our content creation. It's affecting our improved NPC behaviors, but fundamentally it's affecting ethics. And I think that the debates that ensue around there are very important. I have a lot of feelings in that space and a lot of concerns. And I think that is creating, there's a lot of turmoil in the industry around AI and that right now. And I think we're seeing divides forming and so forth. And it's a little bit reminiscent to some of the early practices I saw in the early mobile days as well, in some ways. And we're also seeing cloud gaming creating, I think, more and more a greater democratization of gaming, so greater access. You have internet access versus needing like the high-end hardware. So we're closing some of those gaps, which I think is great. It brings more people in. It's more for us to consider within those communities, though. It's like, what does it mean to have a healthy space that is inclusive of those broader audiences? Immersive tech is really continuing to advance. I know it's not interesting to talk about the metaverse anymore. It's all ChatGPT, but the metaverse is still, if you look at like under the hood, it's still this concept of deeply immersive, deeply scaled gaming, and that's still a thing that is coming. But I will say, the stuff that I see that to me excites me about the future, which is something I think we need nowadays, is that even though in this highly politicized environment, where a lot of things I think have emerged to directly challenge a lot of the work that we do, we are at the same time seeing a very strong emergence of people who fundamentally believe in this work and are stepping up to support this work. That people are stepping up to support TIG, which is phenomenal. People and companies, I should say. But also, I think more than ever, we have some of the strongest foundations on which to do this work, based on all of the hard work of many of you and many more people here who aren't here, pardon me, that are allowing us to be more successful in these endeavors, to have the conversations at the levels we need to with the decision makers to bring change into our games, while players themselves are maturing in terms of the sophistication of what they're asking for. Like, I think we are, yes, we see painful, frustrating things that feel like we are going in the wrong direction, but I see a lot of signal that even in spite of those, we're weathering them so much better because of the strong foundations that all of you have helped to contribute. So I do feel generally very, very positive about the future.
I 100% agree. I love this community because you start to see a group of dedicated practitioners who, yes, they want games to be better. And that's exciting because that's, if as a player, I don't think that's the thing you see ever. And if you do a game well, hopefully you shouldn't know it exists because you're just having a good time. But it's, knowing that there's a group of professionals who are working on the back end to try and make something as good as they can for individuals who just want to show up and play a great game. Like that, that's exciting.
Absolutely. Like, I celebrate each and every one of you. This work is so hard, and we often face such incredible constraints, and that you show up every day because you care about players, you care about your co-developers in the industry and supporting each other in this work. I mean, that is phenomenal, and you deserve to be celebrated in every way. So, as little as it's worth, I see you, I appreciate you, I celebrate you every day.
Well, and that's a great note to end on. Kim, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it, sharing your thoughts. Thank you everyone for joining. Appreciate you being here. And we'll see you on the interwebs.
Thanks so much, everyone.